Sonic the Hedgehog lore is getting too complicated for its own good. So naturally, after Sonic Frontiers launched, Sega announced a job listing for someone to help tie up the story bits that didn't quite make sense. Like how classic Sonic is from an alternate dimension and the past at the same time, or how big the cat was present in cyberspace, or other unresolved questions of that nature. Now I can understand why Sega would think such a position would be necessary with a franchise with so many games and such a huge story, but let me present my personal opinion on the matter. It's not necessary. Most Sonic games after Sonic Adventure 2 have stories that are self contained for the most part. The only exceptions I can think of are Sonic Forces carrying classic Sonic over from Mania and Generations, Sonic 06 and Shadow the Hedgehog carrying Shadow's character arc over from Sonic Adventure 2, and Sonic Generations carrying over the ending of Sonic Colors into the opening cutscene for the final boss, as well as a few references Sonic makes to his past adventures in that game, which do make sense because it was a game to celebrate Sonic's history up to that point. Other than that, the main series games never really tied into a lot of other plot elements, just staple elements of the lore and iconic plot elements or character traits. Then Sonic Frontiers came about and made a reference or flashback to a character or event from almost every other game in the series that not only would confuse most newcomers, but to me felt like soulless padding. I've already made my criticism of the Sonic Frontiers clear. The voice acting is terrible in my opinion, and I think it's generous to even call it acting. You can skip almost the entire game by side looping or fishing. The game is an obvious Sonic themed clone of Zelda, Devil May Cry, and God of War. The game barely felt like a Sonic game when it came out. The story was far too melodramatic for my liking, and it has no reason to be as unpolished as it was, and somehow still is. But that said, the game still isn't an objective technical dumpster fire like Sonic 06, which I had a lot of fun with. But for the longest time, I couldn't have fun with Sonic Frontiers. I'm giving it a second chance and a new repeat playthrough, as it turns out it wasn't actually removed completely from my Steam library, and I'm pleasantly surprised with my experience now that I'm able to form my opinion more clearly without the newer DLC distracting me. I do think Sonic Team at least tried with Sonic Frontiers, but like Sonic 06, the only part of the game I absolutely cannot defend is the story. Well, you could say the voice acting direction too, but to be honest, voice acting is mostly a nitpick for me. So is the story most of the time, but it stands out so badly in Sonic Frontiers that I had to eventually talk about it. A lot of people complained about how Aris Island tried to justify Tails' supposed cowardice in Sonic Forces, which in my opinion is something Sonic fans should have complained about a lot earlier, seeing as he acted really similar in Sonic Unleashed, calling Sonic for help once again when he could have at least tried to fight back against the Gaia monsters. Even if I did agree with that complaint about Sonic Forces, which I don't, seeing as Sonic went missing for 6 months while Tails lost communication with the Resistance and had no one to encourage him to keep going or back him up, like Sonic did in Sonic Adventure 2 right before he almost died, or Elise, of all people, yes, Elise did something that I can actually respect. In Sonic 06, when Sonic was almost dead in that game. And anyway, even if I did think Sonic Forces made a mistake there, Sonic Frontiers didn't need to bring it back up. Sonic Frontiers didn't need to bring anything back up. It could have been a self contained story like every other game before it. I think Sega is making a mistake trying to tie together the events from every Sonic game that already exists. Sega always learns the wrong lessons. When Sonic 06 got so much hate, the number of playable characters would drop down in the next game from 9 to 2. Playable characters weren't the problem. Until Sonic Forces, after Sonic Unleashed, Sonic was the only playable character in the main series 3D games, and the games took on lighter storytelling as well. And while those games were good, and yes, Sonic Lost World is a good game in my opinion, they weren't good because Sonic was the only playable character and because of the lack of dark storytelling. They were good games because they were polished and finished on release, and they knew what Sonic was supposed to be. Sonic Forces then went back to trying to tell a darker story and added a new playable character, and if you've watched my Sonic videos, you know that I think that Sonic Forces is also a good game. However, it received mixed reception from general audience and critics and was hated by the fan base. In my opinion, everything in Sonic Frontiers, from the gameplay to the story to the voice acting, is Sega overcorrecting because of a game that, by all objectively qualitative measures, is mediocre at worst, and because of fans, at least in my opinion, overreacting to that mediocrity. Do I think Sonic Frontiers is a bad game? Do I think the ideas presented in it are objectively bad? Do I personally dislike them even? No. Like I said, the only part of the game that I truly can't defend is the storytelling. Sonic stories don't need to tie back to every prior event in the series. I think Sonic's lore should be more like Mario's, where the staple elements of the story and main setting are well established, and iconic elements of the setting of the game are well established. But each individual story is mostly self contained, kind of like an 11-minute cartoon. There can be references to past events, but they don't need to be in every cutscene, and they shouldn't be huge exposition dumps that focus on the past rather than the present and the future.